Welcome back, everyone, to the .NET MAUI Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things .NET MAUI. I'm James.
I'm David.
And I'm Matt. And I'm disappointed I got kicked off of the intro. I lacked a sweet voice, so I must be it. Must be it. Must be it.
That's true. That's true. We are now scriptless on this podcast, which is a good and terrible idea. And I think I'm just so used to recording merge conflicts with Frank, where Frank refuses to do any cold openings at all. He's just like, no, please never let me talk first. Because whenever we do, it's just always a fumble. But what he doesn't know is I'm fumbling all the time. So he's totally great. So, but sorry, Matt, I took it away. Do you want to do the intro? Go ahead, go for it. I'm ready.
Welcome back, everybody, to the .NET MAUI Podcast, where we're going to talk about MAUI and AI all the time.
Yeah, I like that. All the time, all the things.
Yeah,
until AI eventually talks about MAUI, in which case there's no more use for us.
Till AI talks about us.
It's true. What can't AI do at this point? Well, I wanted to talk really quick before we got into some stuff. Is I spent a lot of time in the last month using the .NET MAUI extension for VS Code on a clean Mac. We talked the last podcast. I wanted to give an update. Yeah, you want to do it, Matt?
No, I want you. I'm just laughing at the update. I want David to sing now too. David has that sweet voice, and he just doesn't. He hasn't unleashed it yet.
He's not going to do it.
You're just going to have to wait.
The greatest part is that we have community members that are going to take samples of something and make some jingle out of it, which I think would be delightful. I've been playing a lot around with Visual Studio Code, .NET MAUI extension, C# Dev Kit, all this stuff. We talked about how I was going to blow away my Mac machine, reformat it, go through all the goodness. I did all that and made a video about it. I had to spend a nice weekend getting things up and running. And I took David's advice. I went down the Xcodes route. I installed the Xcode there. I did find out later on, which we'll talk about, some weird cert things. So I'll talk about that. But I went down the Android Studio route. Delightful. Installing both of those, getting it up and running. I think that really configured a lot of defaults for me. I then realized, and some people asked me, hey, I already had different installs in place. It doesn't seem like it's picking up the right settings in VS Code. So by default, if you just kind of install Xcode, install Android Studio, your Android SDK, your platform stuff all gets installed, and the default environment variables are set up. But you may need to go set those in the VS Code settings, for example, if they're not there because it's not installing it for you. But it was really good. It went overall really good. And then this week, I spent a bunch of time figuring out how to deploy to an iOS device from VS Code on a Mac. How do you think my experience went there, David?
I would hope, given who you are, that it wasn't too bad. I'm surprised to hear you say that it took a while.
Yeah, I would say there's a few things. Is yes, because I know what I'm doing. Because I know what I'm doing, it's great. But you might have some pro tips because I put out a video today about it. We'll put a link to it, and it wasn't that difficult, but you do need to kind of know and understand how iOS and devices and provisioning profiles and cert sort of work. Now, we've been sort of lucky because in VS or VS Code, there's auto provisioning. Now, there's not auto provisioning in VS Code, right, David? Or is there?
No.
Okay, cool. I just want to make sure because that would have made it really easy. So it's really not that hard. So I first needed to create a cert on my machine. You can do that from Xcode. Super simple. Boom. And then what I did is I was talking to Frank about it. I think I was talking to Frank. He said create a wildcard identifier in the developer portal. So a wildcard identifier for your app could be com.david.star or whatever. And then it would be any app ID with that. And then I created a provisioning profile for my devices that were registered on my UUID from the Xcode device portal. And then created that. So that process hasn't changed in about 20 years. So it's been the same forever. So that's not new. And then when I plugged in my phone, it actually just shows up in Visual Studio Code. That's actually kind of cool. Once you put it into the device in developer mode, which is newer, it showed up totally good. But when I went to deploy, it was no. It was nah, fam, not going to happen. So I installed the .NET MAUI archive publish tool from Bandy, which he's on an upcoming on .NET podcast here. And it'll show you all of your provisioning profiles and certs that are on your machine. I was like, what the heck? I just installed them. And it showed me my profiles, but my certs weren't there. And I was like, what's going on? So I looked in my keychain and the cert wasn't trusted. I was like, that's weird. So I trusted it. I was like, okay. And then it still gave me an error. And I looked it up, and super common problem. I don't know if it's just Xcode or something else that was installed or some other reason, but there are additional certs when you install Xcode or other things, the worldwide developer certs from Apple. They weren't installed on my machine at all. Now you can download them manually, but actually the best way to do it is go into Xcode, create a new app, with your identifier and your team stuff. When you go to build, it'll throw all the errors, and there's literally a button that's like fix everything, and it installs all the certs, fix everything for you. And then from there, every new project, anything like that in VS Code, it just picks up the certs, picks up the profiles, boom, and it was good to go. So there's like some weird things because every machine is unique butterfly. But yeah, that was my process. How did I do? Is that about right? I don't know if I did it right.
No, I think that's exactly right. Because we don't have all that help from Visual Studio for Mac, or you weren't on Windows, so Visual Studio is not helping you. You have to rely on Xcode for those things. As you're retelling that, I'm remembering, oh yeah, I had that same trust issue. I had that same need to go find those certs. I ended up downloading them from Apple. I found an issue on Apple's forums that said, oh yeah, those aren't there by default. You got to go get this particular global, international, universal cert thing.
Mm-hmm.
And once you have that, then everything is correct. But I did not know the trick about doing the new app and having Xcode resolve it for you. I mean, clearly it's a gap in the ecosystem for Apple. Like, why do they still have that problem? Because it's not, obviously it's not just me now, it's you. So if it's you and me, it's got to be everybody.
The Stack Overflow issue specifically was very large, with many people complaining. So not just the two of us.
Right. Yeah, but then the other kind of institutional knowledge around wildcard, app identifiers and things like that, so that you don't have to keep recreating provisioning and things like that as you're building stuff.
Yeah.
I don't even think about that very often as something to even tell somebody. You kind of just figure that they will learn that along the way on their journey of creating their first iOS app. I don't know if we document that, because it really is, we document our end of the process, and we try to, share some tips for people generally around iOS and Android development. But anything in the Android and iOS docs, the official Apple and Google docs, really is the source of truth on those sorts of things. And they apply to us as well. It is also interesting to me that you got Android through Android Studio, and that worked out well for you. I agree. That's how I like to go about it. It's the official Google way of doing it. And so I kind of want to stick with that. The one thing, I don't know, did you use the set environment path command in Visual Studio Code to kind of get that going?
No, it just worked.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, it just worked. Okay, so yours was correct. And it just worked because Android Studio set up your environment variable for you.
Exactly.
So if anybody is having that problem, where they had a previous environment variable and it's pointing to a different directory, and you're getting a new Android path set up or whatever, you may need to go into your, I use ZSH, so it's like ZSH profile or ZSHRC hidden file in your user directory. Set your environment variables in there.
Yeah, and I think you can override it in the VS Code settings as well. Like if you want to tell the MAUI extension which one to use. So if you don't want to change it. So there were some folks that were like, hey, I'm still using VS for Mac, for some stuff. Like I want to keep that separate, and have it. I think both of them you can set the paths, but yeah, it makes it easier. That's what I did at least. So yeah.
Yeah, and then you get a consistent experience no matter which tool you're using, whether it's VS Code or something else, or from the command line. Like now it's your system environment, and everything is consistent, whereas VS Mac wasn't always that way. It would have its own thing, and then if you had Android Studio set up, it had its own thing, and some of that was like legacy Xamarin stuff, right? Like back when Xamarin First was creating all the things. It didn't really, it followed its own pattern on some of where to locate things.
Yeah. Yeah. Matt, do you remember all these glorious days of app development back when you were an app developer?
Don't miss the provisioning profiles, wildcard, stars, and all.
You don't miss that? Yeah, no. It's a real hassle. But you know what was super helpful for me as I was resolving my environment variable paths situations was Copilot. Copilot was great. I chatted Copilot inside VS Code and was like, here's what I'm doing, blah, 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 blah. And of course I had my, profiles open in the editor there to make my changes. And it was very helpful at me resolving my issues when I had them.
That's cool. I like that.
Well, how is Copilot with Maui?
How is Copilot with Maui?
Yeah.
It's getting a lot better. So I know that early on, people would find they get a lot of Xamarin responses when they're asking about their project. Some of that was fixed because in the extension, we were able to tell it, hey, this is a Maui project, add that contextual information to every request, every query. You will still occasionally get Xamarin responses, but you can also add the additional double down, this is really a Maui thing. Don't tell me about Xamarin, and get good answers that way. So we're definitely getting better answers now in general. And more training is happening now on the models for future iterations of Copilot and I guess the OpenAI models to make sure that, basically what we're doing is we're gathering known good samples of code and saying, hey, train on these and get more specific current data.
So none of my projects
will continue to improve.
Yeah. I was thinking that about my projects too.
Yeah, not my projects. Don't train it on mine. That's great to hear. Yeah, I think my feeling is every time I use it, it feels like it's has a little bit more awareness there. So every time I've pumped it up or I try to do something, it feels like the answers are a little bit better, a little bit smarter, a little bit more Maui-ified. The nice thing I would say, too, is even though if you do get back a Xamarin Forms answer, it's probably not that far off. You know what I mean? It's like pretty helpful still. Yeah.
Generally in the ballpark, just requires more massaging on our part. But like if you're doing something handler and it gives you a renderer, for example, that's a real hassle because then you're like, that's totally not what I want. Something that I think there's a common misconception, totally not on our, this is what happens when we don't have a script. A common misconception about AI, in particular Copilot, when you're searching for stuff. It is not a glorified search engine. It is not just going out and searching open source repositories and providing you with code snippets from there. And it's not actually actively referencing them as it's providing you with information. It is an AI. And so it knows things and it's giving you answers based on its knowledge, what it has learned. Okay. And so it will occasionally say, hey, halfway through a response, we can't actually show you this. We're redacting it because we did find it in some open repo. So there's some validation that happens where it is actually validating its responses based on what is actually out there. And so it's trying not to give you something that might already be available. But I find that piece of information very interesting because a lot of people they assume that whatever answer it gave me, it's like pulled off Stack Overflow or something. And it's like, no, it's telling you what it knows. Does it have the right knowledge? Hopefully, but maybe not. And so, but that's why it will give you answers that is code that looks really good, looks like it should compile, but it doesn't. Just like you, when you write code thinking, I'm pretty sure this is the API, right? Yeah. And you write it out, or this is what the API would be. It makes sense to me. Let's see if it works. It's that kind of a thing. And so at that point, it's wrong and it needs to, it needs to learn more, but it's not just searching open source repos and providing you with answers. Because our concern was, and here's where I found this, is that we were going to close down a bunch of Xamarin repos, right? And so the concern was that's a lot of, again, institutional knowledge that is stored in that repo. And if that repo goes away, does AI get dumber?
It retrains on less information.
It doesn't, because it already knows that. It already knows the principles of everything, or it has learned on the principles of everything that first, created that repo or whatever. So it was like, if you delete that repo, no, the AI doesn't get dumber.
Oh, interesting. That's really fascinating. I mean, I feel like definitely how I've been using it, it's been improving in that sense. And it's kind of interesting to hear like how the training and things work. And I think the new stuff too, the newer extensions for like VS Code and Visual Studio, I haven't played around with them too much, but you can reference your code file, your code file or your workspace. Like it has the knowledge of what's in your project too, right? So it can do stuff, but you can be explicit about it too. So I think that's fascinating. I've seen demos before where folks would like have different demos of like, hey, there's extra context in here. Like there's code, there's other samples, there's other things. So it kind of has like more context of good design or different things. And it's almost kind of like I have this huge README of like, here's like, imagine you take like Javier's like big, like good looking Maui app, like samples or whatever, and be like, use this as training, as like, and pull some of that stuff in. But I think obviously as your app grows, it's also going to give you context about your application, right? So to me, at least, it's always hard when you're in a new blank project because there's nothing for it to like gleam off of for your coding style and what's in your project. But as your project grows, it can be super helpful. So sometimes when you see Copilot and people are like, I'm going to start with a blank project, it's like, well, the recommendations when you're writing, like, has nothing to base it off of, right? There's no context of, is this a monkey app? Is this a cheese app? Is this a, St. Louis sports app? I don't know what you do in whatever state that is. What state is that? Minnesota?
Right. Missouri.
Perfect. Nailed it.
We eat bratwurst and drink beer.
Yeah. Minneapolis, Minnesota, St. Louis, Missouri. Perfect. Nailed it. I have to say the whole thing or else I don't get it right. That's
all right. Jamie Singleton absolutely thinks I live in Minnesota. She cannot remember.
The worst part is my sister lives in St. Louis, so
that's funny. I do remember that. Yeah. That's great.
Anyways, let's get into topic. Let's just do top 3 features here, David, because .NET 9 Preview 7 came out a few weeks ago. And if people haven't been trying the new .NET 9 previews, this is the one before release candidate. So new releases second Tuesday of every month. Release candidate 1's coming out soon, GA in November for .NET Conf, save the date. But this is the 7th preview, and this is the release I call everyone sneaking in features before release candidate. It feels like this was like a big, chunky, nice one, and the Maui section is big and awesome, and it was cool to see these come together. Do you have a top 1, top 2 features that like people should really go try, give feedback on right now immediately?
Absolutely. So the top one I'm going to raise is not the first one on the list, but it is the CollectionView carousel view on iOS. So what has happened here? CollectionView has been a big area of focus for us, and improving the overall performance, reliability of it, especially. On iOS, there are newer platform-specific controls that we can use and take advantage of. So CollectionView originally was written based on older stuff. And so we wanted to modernize it, but also with the compositional layout and things, improve the overall experience, right? So this is all new in Preview 7. You need to opt into it by overriding the handler. If you go look at our release notes and the documentation on it in the What's New in .NET 9 documentation, you can see the 4 lines of code you need to add to your Maui program. And that will give you the new handler for both the carousel view and collection view, because they're all based on the same ancestor control. So give that a look, try it out with all the variations, group headers and things, and, infinite scroll, threshold stuff, and all the things. It is the first iteration of it. Carousel view in particular is a little unstable, but that is what we've been working on for RC1. So RC1 will be another big step forward for it. and definitely craving the feedback there. Android has been in a much better state as far as reliability, stability. There's still some performance things that we're looking at there, of course, but this one's all about iOS, Mac Catalyst, so check that out.
Do you think this is the goal for it to be turned on by default for GA in November? Is that the idea?
It's really all going to depend on the feedback that we get, right? Like, and we want to make sure that we're not changing behavior, disrupting people's apps. So it may end up being an opt-in thing for .NET 9 and then on by default in .NET 10.
Gotcha.
There is also a slightly different minimum iOS version target in order to take advantage of this. So if you are targeting really old versions of iOS, this may not be the way to go for you initially until you get into the window of what is supported.
That's cool.
Because again, it's a newer platform-specific implementation than was previously used, so different requirement.
Nice. That makes sense. I also think it's cool too that actually this is a cool example of the handler architecture of using and replacing the handler that's used for the collection view, which means, when I want to point this out, when David says the 4 lines of code, it is in your program CS file where you're literally saying add handler, and you're basically overriding the handler that the system is using, which means your collection view code doesn't change, right? It's actually just kind of this override. So this is really neat. And I never really thought of it until seeing it like this in the product, but this means that the team could iterate, that you could have different community members, iterate, have their own flavor of it. I think I've seen it, but I've never made the connection, I guess, in 3 years for some reason of how this works. But now it makes sense to me as I've read the documentation, but it's like, I feel like often some people are like, oh, it's kind of like spicing up and like adding a feature to a handler, but this is actually like replacing the handler. Like this is literally saying, hey, collection view, go use collection view handler 2, right? So the team could in the future have like 3, 4, 5. Like you could almost, this is actually really fascinating. It's like, if you didn't like how like tabs worked, or you didn't like how list view works, like you could literally replace the entire thing with your own custom thing. And then everyone code is the same, but it may style it 100% different. That's wild. I never.
No, you're absolutely correct. Yeah. And we talk to a lot of companies and customers, right? And we know they're very rarely all doing the same stuff, and they have different requirements for their applications and even the same control, like a collection view. So it's not without precedent that somebody would need a collection view that does something very specific for their need that doesn't need to be there for everybody else. And, replacing a whole control like collection view is a big endeavor. Like, John and Rui and Shane have been working on this for quite a bit. So not everybody's going to go replace an entire control like collection view. But if you're somebody like me, you want to add functionality onto a control, or you want to just replace how one particular property behaves, then you can do that. That's how I end up removing borders off of all the entries and pickers. Like, I don't want the border there. I'm going to style it differently and just remove it for all of them. And I can do that again in just a few lines of code in my MAUI program. That's by cool. Using that handler architecture. So, I'm glad to see that it is catching on and the value is starting to be demonstrated.
Nice. I like it. That's awesome. Matt, you got a pick? You got a pick from the release notes? Excites you?
No. I'm getting ready for the AI stuff here. But no.
Okay. I'll give you more time to read through them. I'll take mine
let me
while you click on the link. Well, there's a few. Like, you think I would just go into hybrid web view and probably, is that my pick? We'll come back around. That's going to be my second pick. I want to actually talk about a big potential change. But I don't want to talk about it yet because I actually have a new feature that I think is my favorite feature because it's a new control.
It's a long list of cool stuff.
It is a long list of cool stuff. So this one's actually really neat. I'm a sucker for adding more content, more controls, more things into .NET MAUI. So there's a new control and a new property that the control is paired with, but also doesn't have to be paired with, which is the title bar. So if you're a Windows user or Mac user, basically, there's that top piece where there's like the close, maximize, minimize. And on a Windows app, like the back button's there and things like that. And like there's different things on Mac as well. But this title bar control is actually a standard control inside of the WinUI toolkit. And what's really neat about that is you can kind of put a bunch of stuff up there. So you could put a search bar, you could put like your little sign in like logo, you could do a little subtitle, title. You have like really fine grained control that gives your app personality. So it's a brand new title bar control that has main content, trailing content, subtitle, and you can use on the new window.titlebar property, you can set a title bar in it, which means that the title bar on top is like super duper nice, really nice and fleshed out. And that can be controlled in XAML or in code, which is really cool. So you can override that when things are appearing, which is neat. Now, that being said, what I actually think is my favorite feature about this is that it's actually just a control, which means technically you can put the control anywhere. You want that title bar to be on the bottom, not on the title, on the footer. It can just be down there, right? You want to put it in your Android app, just go for it. You want to put it in your iOS app, go for it, right? So this is really neat. And now the window title bar property is on Windows, but it's coming to Mac. I already saw in the repo. You can see like the work being done on it as well for the next, hopefully, releases or whatever. But it's super customizable. And I'm just like, I'm a fan of, before, if you were to create this, you'd be combining and creating a grid and all this other stuff. But now it's like roast fills integrated. So I think that's really neat. And that's a community contribution, which is super cool.
Yeah, it's great. And I'm very, very much looking forward to it coming to the Mac.
More controls. All right, Matt, you got a feature?
Right. Yes. I'm here. All right. You know what? It seems like it's a very small improvement.
Yep.
But I'm all about the native embedding, right? Because I really like getting out the look and feel exactly what we want. And it's, from what I'm reading here, it's super, super easy to, or a minor feature here just to swap it in where you don't need a compatibility package any longer. And it's just, you can get your MAUI stuff into your .NET Android or .NET iOS app.
Yeah,
that's cool.
We found a lot of customers.
I like that.
Yeah, we found a lot of customers making their transition from Xamarin Forms to .NET MAUI more than we perhaps realized. We're taking advantage of this native embedding functionality, and so we really looked to how can we improve it in .NET MAUI. So Matthew Leibowitz primarily has worked on that whole API to improve it. And yeah, so essentially anybody, if you're wondering exactly what this is, you can take cross-platform UI from .NET MAUI, the controls that run everywhere, and you can bring that into just pure iOS storyboard land, Android XML layout land, etc. You can new up that piece of the .NET MAUI. It doesn't have to be the whole app. It can just be a page, could be a control. And you can get a reference to the native part of it and share it among your applications. So cool. We find customers will have, suites of apps, right? And some of them will be pure Xamarin Form or .NET MAUI. Now I'm messing up the names of the products. Pure .NET MAUI, but then they'll have some that are just an Android app because it only ever needs to run on Android, but they want to share a login screen dialog, or they want to share, an about page, a support page, or a widget that is used across various applications. And this is a great way for them to do that.
Yeah, that's super cool. You're going to talk about hybrid web view? It's in the box. It's in the box, new control.
It is in the box. Why would I want to have a hybrid web view? Doesn't Blazor web view and the regular web view do everything?
I don't know, doesn't it? I mean, it's a super valid question. Isn't Blazor just, you can do HTML and it can do JavaScript interop and all that other stuff? Why would I need this, David?
It can, but this one is more customized for applications running Angular, React, Vue, or just any bare bones JS. So it's more around the JS interop, whereas Blazor Web View can do some of that stuff, but it's really, the Blazor Web View is much more purely about the Blazor hybrid experience, bringing Blazor components together. So if you've got React, Angular, Vue, or your homegrown JS, or what is it, Ember JS, or I don't know, there's so many. Then the hybrid web view is the way to go. It's been an experiment that's been out there for probably a few years at this point, and we've showed it at Build and .NET Conf. And we've seen enough traction on it that people are interested in it that it's now in the box. And so you can take advantage of it, take a bet on it.
That's super cool. There's tons of great stuff in here. There are improvements to the Blazor web view, to back button, to window management. There's an Xcode sync CLI tool that can be used with VS Code, which is super cool. New things with the web view control, new lifecycle events, which are super rad. One that's super fascinating to think about is that main page is now obsolete. So prepare yourselves for glory. Gerald reached out. He's like, what do you think about this? And I was like, okay, sure. It makes sense. So I'm excited to see how that impacts stuff. It's obsolete. It's not removed, right, David?
Yeah. Yeah. And the code to modernize that is super easy. Really what we're doing behind the scenes right now is we're already creating a window and then applying that main page property to the page of the window.
Yeah.
So if you think of your application purely from like a tree standpoint, it's the window, the page is set on the window, which is just whatever view you're putting on there. And then everything falls out from there. So main page being kind of a legacy concept from the one-page world of mobile just didn't make as much sense anymore. And so now it's time to expose what's really been happening all along in .NET MAUI behind the scenes, because we're finding that, some people are like, where's my window? I don't know where my window is. It's like, well, we're just going to show it to you now.
Yeah.
It's always been there all along, taking care of you.
Good. It's good. And you can just throw an app shell inside of it. It makes sense. It all makes sense to me, David. I approve. On to the future, many, many windows. And talking about the future, let's talk about Matt's AI pick of the feature of the AI goodness, sparkles, and awesomeness of the week of the podcast. And there's AI everywhere. Let's go, Matt.
I'm glad we got the sparkles lyric in there. That was a big controversy coming into here, but it made it in. Good.
Yes.
Good. Thanks for backing me up on that one, David.
You're welcome.
Anyways, there's a couple different things I wanted to talk about here. Where should we start? We'll start with the OpenAI.NET SDK. Not the Azure OpenAI.NET SDK, but the OpenAI.NET SDK. We talked about it, I think, at Build a little bit in a preview. And it's not NGA yet, but it's coming on Northern Hemisphere fall. And if you saw the way it is raining and foggy here in Seattle, it is almost fall. So, and so this is cool. This is .NET's everywhere, and .NET can do AI everywhere, which is actually a really big deal because when you think AI, you normally think Python and .NET. .NET's the best language, or .NET's the best language. C# the best language, unless you like F#, but .NET's the best platform around, and we want to be able to do AI on .NET. So OpenAI, the official SDK, if you go to the docs, I think it's docs.openai.com, you will now find .NET as a first-class citizen there, and code examples and everything else. So that's super cool. It's out there. Our Azure OpenAI SDK is now built on top of that. And Microsoft obviously worked really closely with OpenAI to get this up and going. So that's awesome. .NET now is, you want to do AI? Use C#, use .NET. Put it into your MAUI apps. Why not? Native embed it. Bring your MAUI controls into Android and iOS and really have a ball. .NET instead of Swift. David, approve? Thumbs up, thumbs down?
So I have an app that uses OpenAI services behind the scenes, and I wrote it with the Azure SDK. At the time that I was writing it, it was the only option. And it made sense. So with the Azure SDK, folks may not know this, you can point it at Azure and use your Azure instance and keep everything there. Or you can use the OpenAI endpoint that you create with your paid account, et cetera. So I have a paid account and I utilize it. And so it goes both ways. And I thought, well, that's great because then I am using an Azure SDK. And if I ever wanted to move everything over to an Azure hosted instance, I could do that. But this gets me up and going faster. And then when this new library came out that you're mentioning, I was like, oh, well, should I port my stuff to it? Like, what is the Azure SDK good for? What is the OpenAI SDK good for? Like, when should I pick one or the other? And that was actually a conversation that happened also in the comments of the announcement blog post. So both can do pretty much all the same stuff, right?
Azure is built on top of the OpenAI SDK. So I'm going to take a step back here. And one of the biggest goodnesses that you're going to get with the OpenAI SDK, or the fact that it's coming out of OpenAI, is that the latest and greatest OpenAI stuff, like when they announce assistants, is that you get essentially day one support for the latest and greatest OpenAI stuff with .NET right away. So it's kind of like back in the Xamarin day when you had a new iOS, day one support. Same thing now, except for AI stuff with OpenAI. Yeah. So that's one of the greatest, check marks. And the second, like, when would you use OpenAI versus the Azure SDKs? Well, the obviously answer is, well, when you have your models hosted on Azure. But one of the big things that you get when you host your models on Azure are things like data isolation. Like, so if you're using other Azure things like Cosmos or Azure SQL, you can start talking with managed identity between us. You get like the Azure security model popped on top, so you don't have to pass your API keys back and forth. You can just log in, like even on Visual Studio. So you're logged into Visual Studio, David, and then you can just say, instead of logging in, passing a key, you can just say new default Azure credential. And then that way you log in. So you're logged in as you. A little bit different when you're running on a mobile app, because you're not necessarily logged in that way unless you're using MCell. So mobile's always introducing a bunch of fun things.
We like to make things difficult. And for anybody listening, you may think I was just teeing Matt up on this stuff. I actually didn't, and I don't know that stuff. So I'm glad that you actually had the answers to some of those.
Yeah,
things.
No,
I am actually logged into Visual Studio, but if people know me, you know that I primarily am coding in VS Code on a Mac. So,
but VS Code would work too, because you're logged in.
Okay.
That's cool.
I didn't actually know that either. Yeah. So I'm learning so many things.
Well, assuming that you hooked up your GitHub account to Azure.
I am absolutely hooked up, because I got to
check that out. Yeah, I have to check that out to make sure that all falls through. I'm sure it does. But question mark, Matt will check out and put a big. We'll have James do an extra song at the end.
Right, it totally works because all the products work seamless together.
Yeah. So the second thing, I had a nice segue to it. Oh, all right. So we have the OpenAI models sitting on OpenAI. You have the OpenAI models sitting on Azure. Azure gives you like the security roll up, one of the things around it. But let's say you wanted to use one of the other many models that are.
You're telling me there's more models in the world than just the single one? There's only one. GPT-1.
GPT 1.0, which was
1.0.
Ada. That's an embedding model, I think. But it used to go like Ada, Babbage. I forget what they were called, but ABC.
Oh.
Yeah. And they're named after scientists too. Curie was like the third one. Anywho, there are many different ones. Like there was one called Microsoft Phi. Some people pronounce it B, which was recently released from Microsoft Research. There's all the Mistral models. Facebook has the Llama models. There's Ollama models, which is Open Llama models. There are models all over the place. What's cool is that you can run these models on top of Azure, right? The model's just simply a piece of code, right? And you just need a compute resource to run it on. So we have something that's called Model Catalog, runs on Azure AI Studio. Great. But you're wondering, David, I can see it. How do I call it from my .NET app? New SDK. Luis just wrote about it. When does that blog post come out? It was just recently.
Or last week, I think, yeah.
Yeah. It's called the Azure AI.inference SDK. So what is inference? Good question. It's just a fancy AI term for meaning I'm going to use the model and talk to it. So but what's cool, it's any model. It's like it sits up a level. So you're not just saying I can talk with OpenAI. I can use this same SDK and talk to Phi or one of the Mistral or one of the Llama ones that we have out. So it's like this, sits up a level, and you can use like chat completions with it, and so
that's super useful, because one of the things that I've learned and experienced from writing my application as I move from GPT 3.5 to 4 O. And the different ones is they're not all the same, and it's not always a forward step of, they're getting faster. Like sometimes they get slower, but they're better at certain things, and sometimes they get faster and then they kind of lose a little bit of the fidelity on some stuff. And it's like all those different models you just mentioned, some of them are better at other tests. And so if I can write all my code in one way using that API or using that SDK you just mentioned, but then swap out the LLM models on the backside and see which one really meets my needs the best, that seems like a huge advantage.
Yeah. And I'm just looking through all the models here. There are 1,739 models, which is probably way too many.
Is there a model to search the models? Like which one is the best?
There's a search box. Yeah, and there's
a search box.
Yeah. Inference tasks, so you can figure out whether it's best for text generation or text classification, token classification, question answering. So we should get a model deployed for that and ask it that question.
That's right. That's what we need.
Yeah. So, you can figure out stuff. Yeah. Everything is, like you said, fine-tuned for something specific. And then you can fine-tune them yourself, too. You can, really zero in on what you want. But that is above our smartness quotient that we have here. And all the Hugging Face models are, I shouldn't say all, Hugging Face is huge, but there's a lot of Hugging Face models there as well.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so it's pretty exciting that we have this SDK out there that lets you kind of get at them. And GitHub has something called GitHub Models now, which, as you would imagine, sounds a lot like Azure AI Studio with all those models. So I'm not sure if GitHub Models has full access to everything we just talked about, but it has a lot in there. And you can use the Azure AI Inference SDK to talk to the GitHub Models one. And the pricing for GitHub Models, I don't know what it is because it's brand new. It's still in a waitlist mode, but it's easier to get at and it's super easy to use. And I actually think it's going to be relatively obtainable for as far as pricing goes for everybody.
Nice.
So that's actually super cool that you don't actually have to go through the whole Azure setup to get at the GitHub Models stuff. There is, I'm looking at right now, free, pro, and team. Interesting.
Nice.
So, yeah.
I like it. Well, cool.
There you go.
Now, if we'll put links to all the show notes and all the things down there for all the things that we talked about today. Any final thoughts from you, David or Matt, at all?
So, yes. First final thought. I want to shout out to Gerald Versluis for reaching over 100,000 subscribers on the YouTubes.
Wow.
So he's coming at you, James. You got 138, my friend.
I like it. Go, Gerald. Whoop, 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 whoop.
Congrats.
Coming. Big
so that's a
moment.
huge accomplishment. Do you get like a plaque or something for 100,000?
That's a plaque for 100K. Yep. It's a 100K and then 5 and then 1 million. So it's just a pretty big gap. Yeah.
That is a huge gap.
Yeah. They're like, yeah. That's awesome.
So,
congrats.
So I wanted to mention that. And then back to the product news. RC1, it looks like we are on track to ship Xcode 16 support.
Ooh.
So that will bring us iOS 18 and all the things that are beta there so that we can all be ready for that. Something that I guess is a caveat there, just a note for everybody. Xcode 16 runs on the newest version, the beta of macOS. The beta version of macOS, to my knowledge, does not support Xcode 15. So beware upgrading your macOS boxes prematurely.
Wow.
Because you won't be able to use the stable Xcode, if that is still the case from Apple, which last I heard it was.
I believe so as well. I think Frank was talking about that in general. Yes. I already noted that Xcode 16.1 is in beta already.
Yeah, because that's the one I think that's pushing their Apple Intelligence and everything. I got that beta on my phone, so
nice.
It's listening to us right now.
Da-na-na-na. All right, well, we got to thank all of our listeners for listening. And also, if you watch this on YouTube and you're at the end of this podcast and you're like, wow, they didn't show any code. I just looked at their faces for 45 minutes. And that's because it's a podcast, not a video. Some people, we did a podcast with Rachel about accessibility. I had a great discussion about accessibility there. And someone's like, 22 minutes and no code was shown. It was like, because it's a podcast. You can subscribe in your favorite podcast app like Spotify, YouTube Music, Apple Podcast, Overcast, all the different podcasts out there. You can rate, review. You can like. If you are on YouTube, you can watch us, look at each other kind of through the magic of our webcams, which is cool. But yeah, definitely give it a go. And of course, stay subscribed to the .NET YouTube. There's tons of good stuff, and .NET Conf in November. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and thanks David and Matt. I appreciate it for all the .NET and AI goodies.
Thanks for the
songs, James.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, super scripted. All right, until next time, this has been the .NET MAUI Podcast. Thanks everyone for watching.
Bye-bye.